Abigail Carter pressed both hands flat against the wooden door of the last employer in Dry Creek and felt it shut in her face so hard the frame rattled her teeth. 11 doors, 11 rejections. Not one man had let her finish a sentence before his eyes traveled down the length of her, and his expression closed like a trap. She turned away, walked to the water trough at the edge of the road, sat down on the dirt because her legs had finally stopped obeying her, and said the thing she had never said out loud before. "I can cook well enough to feed a whole county," she said to nobody, to the sky, to the dust. "But no man on this earth will ever love me." She pressed her knuckles against her mouth and held the rest inside. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye slide right past you, like you weren't worth the effort of being seen, then this story is for you. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what happens to Abigail Carter in the valley of Dry Creek, Wyoming, is going to shake something loose in your chest that you forgot was still there. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that water trough, because someone just heard every word she said. The summer of 1887 had baked Dry Creek, Wyoming down to its bones. The wagon road into town was cracked like old pottery, and the cottonwood trees along the creek bed had given up dropping shade weeks ago. Abigail Carter had been walking since early morning, and the $40 folded inside her coat pocket felt lighter than it had any right to, knowing it was everything she owned in the world. She was a large woman, built broad through the shoulders, with hands that had worked kitchens and farms and every variation of hard circumstance that life had offered her without apology. Her dark hair was pinned back with a practicality that had long since replaced any interest in appearance, and her dress, dark wool slightly worn at the hem, was entirely wrong for the heat. But it was what she had. She carried a wooden chest strapped across her back with leather cord, and inside that chest were 62 handwritten recipe cards, a set of knives wrapped in oilcloth, and a cast-iron spice tin that had belonged to her mother. That chest was the only inheritance she had ever received. She had come to Dry Creek because a woman in Laramie told her there were 3 ranching operations hiring seasonal cooks, and that the valley paid fair wages if a person could prove their worth in the first week. Abigail had proven her worth in kitchens for 19 years. She had fed 30-man crews during cattle drives in Nebraska. She had managed provisioning for a mining camp outside Cheyenne that ran 400 men through 3 rotating shifts. She had kept a boarding house kitchen operating through a blizzard that killed 2 horses and a stockman, and not one boarder had gone without a hot meal. She knew what she was worth. The problem was that nobody here had asked. The first door she knocked on belonged to the Glenmore Ranch operation on the north edge of town, a well-kept outfit with whitewashed fence posts and a cook fire already smoking behind the main building. The foreman who answered looked at her for exactly 2 seconds before he said, "We need someone who can pull weight around here, not add to it," and shut the door. Abigail stood on that porch for a moment, absorbing it, then walked back down the steps. The second door was the Harker boarding house, where the owner, a thin woman named Mrs. Harker, said she was looking for someone presentable, and let her eyes do the rest of the talking. By the 5th door, Abigail had stopped expecting courtesy. By the 8th, she had stopped expecting anything at all. The 9th was a saloon kitchen, where a man named Dooley laughed outright when she stated her qualifications, actually laughed, leaning back in his chair and slapping the arm of it, and said he didn't run a charity operation. The 10th was a hotel on the main street, where the manager listened to 45 seconds of her work history, then said he had just filled the position, which was a lie she could see plainly on his face. The 11th was a ranch provisioning office where a man in a clean vest told her with genuine bewilderment that he couldn't understand why she'd even made the trip. That was where she had pressed her hands against the door. That was when her legs stopped working properly. She found the water trough at the south edge of the main road, where a hitching post cast a narrow strip of afternoon shadow, and she sat down on the packed earth beside it, because sitting on the trough rim itself would have required more dignity than she currently possessed. She set the recipe chest down between her feet. She let the heat press down on her shoulders, and she looked out at the dust of the road and at the mountains beyond the valley that were purple and indifferent and enormous. "I can cook well enough to feed a whole county," she said, because she needed to hear herself say something true. "But no man on this earth will ever love me." She pressed her knuckles against her mouth. She was not a woman who wept easily or often, and she did not weep now. She simply sat with the statement because it had the particular weight of something she had always known and never permitted herself to speak plainly. And now that it was out in the air, it felt both terrible and strangely clean, the way a wound does when you finally stop pretending it isn't there. She had been practical about her life. She had learned early that certain things would not be available to her in the way they were available to other women, and she had built her existence accordingly. Her value in her work, her satisfaction in competence, her future in careful saving and careful planning. She had not asked for more than what a person like her could reasonably expect. She had not expected to feel this particular quality of alone. "That's a hard thing to say out loud." The voice came from behind her and to the left, and Abigail did not startle because she was too tired to startle properly. But she turned her head and saw a man standing a few feet off, holding the reins of a gray horse and watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. He was lean through the shoulders, dark-haired somewhere around 30, wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a brown vest that had seen considerable use. His hat was in his hand rather than on his head, which she registered as a mark of deliberate respect because the sun was still fierce. "I apologize," he said. "I wasn't listening on purpose. I was coming out of Parsons' feed store and you were right there. Didn't mean to hear something private." "Then you should have kept walking," Abigail said, not unkindly but without warmth. "Yes, ma'am, I should have." He didn't move. "What kind of cooking?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Beg your pardon. You said you could cook for a county. I'm wondering what kind." He said it without any trace of the mockery she had trained herself to watch for, and he was looking at her the way a person looks at someone they're genuinely trying to understand, rather than assess for some category of usefulness or deficiency. "Camp cooking, kitchen work, baking, or full provisioning?" "All of it," Abigail said flatly. 19 years. Cattle drives, mining camps, boarding houses, private ranches. I've managed provision budgets of up to $800 a month. I've cooked for work crews of 40 and dinner parties of 6, and I can keep a kitchen ledger without a bookkeeper if the operation requires it. He put his hat back on. "How many places did you try today?" 11. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite anger, but was in that neighborhood. "Every one of them said no." "They did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got a ranch 6 miles east of here, Red Canyon. We've been short a cook since March and I've got 11 men eating badly and feeling it. I can't promise you anything permanent. I'd want 2 weeks to see how the operation fits." He looked at her steadily. "But I can promise you that nobody on my property is going to shut a door in your face before you finish talking." Abigail studied him. She had developed a considerable ability to assess a man's sincerity over 19 years of working in environments where her options were limited and the cost of a misjudgment was high. She looked at his hands, which were calloused and showed evidence of actual ranch work rather than supervision only. She looked at the horse, which was well kept and calm in a way that told you something about the patience of its owner. She looked at his face. He was not performing kindness for an audience. There was no audience. 2 weeks, she said. "What's the wage?" $1.50 a day plus room and board. That was above standard, and they both knew it. She didn't say that. She said, "What's your name?" "Silas Reed." "Abigail Carter." She stood up, which required effort she refused to make visible, and picked up her recipe chest. "I'll want to see the kitchen before I agree to anything." The corner of his mouth moved slightly. "Fair enough, Miss Carter." The ride out to Red Canyon Ranch took 40 minutes, and Silas Reed spent most of it asking her questions about provisioning logistics and inventory management and crew scheduling, which was not what she expected. Men who hired cooks did not typically inquire about her views on weekly versus bi-weekly supply ordering, or her approach to managing food waste in a large operation. Men who hired cooks asked if she could make biscuits and if she'd had any complaints. He asked her about complaints too eventually. She told him the truth, that she'd had 3 in 19 years, 2 of which were from men who objected to the portions she'd designated for. "What happened to the third?" he asked. "A foreman in Nebraska who felt I was insufficiently agreeable." "Were you?" "I was disagreeable about him adjusting the supply receipts to pocket the difference," Abigail said. "If that's insufficiently agreeable, then yes." Silas Reed rode in silence for a moment. "What happened to him?" "He lost his position." She paused. "The owner believed me rather than him, which I will admit surprised me considerably at the time." "Why?" She looked at him. He asked it like he genuinely didn't know the answer, and she considered for a moment whether it was worth explaining, then decided it was. "Men with authority tend to believe other men," she said, "especially over women. Especially over women who look like me." He didn't offer a contradiction or a reassurance. He just nodded once like he was filing the information carefully. "I'm not like that. Mr. Reed," she said, "every man I've ever worked for has said something equivalent to that statement. I'll know whether it's true by the end of the 2 weeks." He almost smiled. "That's fair." Red Canyon Ranch announced itself first by smell wood smoke and cattle and the particular dusty sweetness of sun-warmed hay, and then by the low structures appearing out of the landscape, the main house and the bunkhouse and the barn arranged around a central yard where the dry ground was packed hard by years of hooves and boots and wagon wheels. Several men were working near the corral fence, and they stopped to watch as Silas rode in with an unfamiliar figure beside him. Abigail had been watched before. She kept her expression neutral and her back straight and let the watching happen without responding to it. Silas dismounted and came around to offer assistance that she didn't require and didn't take stepping down herself with practiced efficiency. He didn't make anything of it. "Kitchen's through here," he said. The kitchen was attached to the back of the main house, and the moment Abigail walked through the door, she understood with complete clarity why the men had been eating badly since March. The work surface was inadequate for the size of the operation. The stove needed immediate attention to its flue. The dry goods were stored without any logical organization, and the supply inventory. She found the logbook in less than 2 minutes, because the logbook was the first thing she always found, was a document of such cheerful imprecision that it told her almost nothing useful about what was actually in the building. She stood in the middle of the kitchen and turned slowly cataloging. "Well," Silas said from the doorway, "you need 3 days of organization before I can cook a proper meal," she said. "Not because I'm particular, but because I can't work safely in a space where I don't know where things are and can't trust the inventory record. In the meantime, I can make do with what's immediately visible and produce something better than what they've been getting." She looked at the stove. "Is there someone who can look at that flue today?" "I can. Then, if you do that while I reorganize the dry goods, I can have proper supper on the table by 6. He looked at her for a moment. "You've been traveling all day and tried 11 places." "I'm aware of that, Mr. Reed." "I'm saying you don't have to start tonight." "I want to see how the stove operates," she said. "And the men need a real meal. So, the flue." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'll get my tools." By 6 o'clock, Abigail had the stove functioning correctly, the dry goods organized by type and frequency of use, the work surface cleaned and reset, and a supper on the table that included proper beef stew with vegetables that had been prepared with attention to texture. Fresh cornbread from a starter she'd been maintaining in a jar in her chest for 3 years, and a pot of coffee made correctly. The 11 ranch hands came to the table expecting the indifferent food they'd been surviving on, and what happened when they tasted the meal was not dramatic. It was quiet. A man named Walt took 1 bite of the stew and put his spoon down and said, "Lord above," with the sincere gratitude of someone who has been fed something that actually tastes like food. A young hand named Charlie reached for a second piece of cornbread before he'd finished his first, then caught himself and looked at her with genuine contrition, as if he'd forgotten that adults were present. "Take it," Abigail said. "There's enough." Silas ate at the end of the table, watching his men without making it obvious he was watching, and Abigail watched him from the kitchen doorway without making it obvious she was watching either. The change in the room was perceptible, a loosening, a recovery of something that had been leaking away slowly for months. She had seen it before. She knew exactly what it was. A crew that is fed well is a crew that can work well. Food was not incidental to a ranch's function. Food was structural. After supper, when the men had gone back to the bunkhouse and Silas was helping her clear the table in a way she hadn't expected and didn't comment on, he said, "That's the best meal that kitchen has produced in at least 2 years. It'll be better once I've had 3 days to properly organize," she said. He set a stack of plates down and looked at her directly. "Miss Carter, I want you to know that the offer stands as long as you want it. 2 weeks is the trial period. The position is open indefinitely after that if it suits you. I told you I'd know more in 2 weeks. You did," he said. "I'm saying what I know right now." She looked at him, and the honest thing would have been to say that nobody had spoken to her quite like that in a very long time, with that particular quality of directness and respect combined without any visible agenda behind it. She didn't say the honest thing. "Good night, Mr. Reed," she said. "Good night, Miss Carter." She was given a small room off the kitchen private, which she hadn't expected, with a narrow bed and a window facing east, and she sat on the edge of the bed with the recipe chest across her knees and let the silence of the ranch settle around her. Outside, she could hear the horses and the distant sounds of the bunkhouse, and somewhere far off a coyote explaining its position to the dark. She had learned not to hope for things too quickly. She had learned it the way a person learns things that cost them slowly through repetition, through the accumulation of evidence. But sitting in that room, which was hers, which had a lock on the door and a view of the open sky, she permitted herself one very small and carefully contained thought. This might be different. She opened the recipe chest, took out the ledger she always kept alongside the recipe cards, a personal copy of every supply account she'd ever managed, and placed it on the small table beside the bed. Then she began by lamplight to review what she'd seen in the kitchen inventory log. She was halfway through the first month's entries when she stopped. She went back 3 pages and read a column of figures again more slowly. Then she reached for her pencil. By the time the rancher went quiet and the lamp oil was running low, Abigail Carter had identified something in Red Canyon Ranch's supply accounts that had nothing to do with disorganization. She sat for a long time looking at the numbers. Then she closed the book carefully and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling with the focused expression of a woman who has found something she was not looking for and is now deciding with great deliberateness exactly what to do about it. She did not sleep much that night, not because the bed was uncomfortable. It was narrow, but clean. And after months of worse accommodations, she had learned to be grateful for clean. But because the numbers she had found in the supply ledger kept rearranging themselves behind her eyes every time she closed them, insisting on being looked at again, confirming themselves against her will with the particular stubbornness of figures that have already told you everything they're going to tell you and are simply waiting for you to accept it. She rose before dawn, dressed in the dark, and was in the kitchen with the lamp lit and the stove loaded before any sound came from the bunkhouse. She worked by habit while she thought flour measured lard, cut in the starter she'd been keeping alive for 3 years, fed and set to work in the warmth near the stove, and she thought carefully and in sequence the way she had trained herself to think about financial irregularities, which was to start from what she knew for certain and resist the pull toward conclusions until the evidence made them unavoidable. What she knew for certain was this: the supply invoices from Harlan Trading Company charged Red Canyon Ranch prices that were on average between 22 and 31% above what she had paid for identical goods in comparable Wyoming operations over the past decade. She knew comparable prices because she had kept records of every supply account she had ever managed, not out of suspicion, but out of professional discipline, because a cook who understood the true cost of what she was purchasing was a cook who could make good decisions about substitution and priority and where an operation's money was actually going. She had not expected those records to be useful in this particular way, but they were. What she did not yet know was whether Silas Reed was aware of the overcharging. That was the question that had kept her awake, because it split the situation into 2 very different territories. If he knew then, she was working for a man who was comfortable with dishonest accounting, and she needed to understand what that meant for her position. If he didn't know, then someone had been systematically extracting money from this ranch for an extended period, and he deserved to have that information delivered to him by someone who could explain what the numbers actually showed. She was making her second assessment of which territory she was in when Silas Reed came through the kitchen door at 5:15 in the morning and stopped when he saw her. "You're up early," he said. "So are you, Mr. Reed?" "I'm always up at 5. I didn't know what your hours were." He looked at the stove, at the evidence of a breakfast already well underway, and then at her face, which she kept neutral. "Did you sleep?" "Adequately." She turned back to the biscuit dough. "Sit down. I need to talk to you about something." There was a pause behind her. He pulled out a chair and sat. She could hear it in the quality of his silence. He was the kind of man who understood that when someone used that particular phrasing and that particular tone, the appropriate response was to sit down and listen rather than ask preliminary questions. She brought the ledger to the table and set it in front of him, open to the page she'd marked. Then she sat down across from him and placed her own personal account book beside it, open to the corresponding period. "These are your supply invoices from Harlan Trading Company going back 14 months, she said. "This is my personal record of supply costs in Wyoming operations over the past 10 years. I want you to look at the column I've marked on the left and tell me if those prices match what you understood you were paying." He looked at the marked column. He was quiet for a moment. "I knew we were paying more than the previous year," he said slowly. "I thought it was the drought, supply difficulties." Harlan said the freight costs had gone up. "Freight costs for flour did go up last year," Abigail said, "by approximately 4%. Look at the price increase marked in red." She pointed. "That is 31%, for flour alone." She moved her finger to the next line. "Salt, 28%. Cornmeal, 24%. She sat back. "Those increases have nothing to do with freight. That is a margin someone is taking." Silas Reed looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time without speaking, and Abigail watched his face move through several things. First, the resistance that any person feels when confronted with information that requires them to revise a significant assumption. Then, the recognition that the numbers were not ambiguous, and then something quieter and harder that settled in around his eyes and jaw. "How long?" he said. "The ledger only goes back 14 months, she said, "but the pattern is consistent from the first page. This didn't start recently. Harlan's been supplying this ranch for 7 years. The weight of that sat between them. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." He closed the ledger, opened it again, looked at the numbers once more as if expecting them to have changed. They had not. He pressed one hand flat on the page and stared at it, and Abigail said nothing because there was nothing useful to say in that particular moment. She had learned that when you delivered information that changed a person's understanding of their own situation, the most valuable thing you could offer them immediately afterward was silence. Finally, he said, "How much?" "Over 14 months, based on the overcharge percentages and the purchase volumes, I estimate somewhere between $800 and $1,100 in excess charges, possibly more if the pattern holds at a higher rate in earlier years." He was very still. "Mr. Reed," she said, "I want to be clear that I have not drawn any conclusions about what this means or who is responsible beyond the invoices themselves. What I can tell you is what the numbers show, and the numbers show that you have been charged significantly more than market rate for your supplies in a pattern that is too consistent to be error." "It's not error," he said, and his voice was flat. "Harlan knew my numbers. He knew exactly what I could absorb." "Yes," she said. "That's what the consistency suggests." He stood up, moved to the window, stood there with his back to her. Outside the ranch was beginning to wake. She could hear the first sounds from the bunkhouse boots on wood voices, low and rough with sleep. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. It wasn't accusatory. It was a genuine question. "You just got here. You could have said nothing. Kept your head down, done the cooking, collected the wage. Mr. Reed. Abigail said, I found a financial irregularity in your accounts. That's information that belongs to you. I don't work differently depending on whether anyone's watching. She paused. And I found it because I know what things should cost, and I keep records. If you want me to put together a complete analysis, month by month, category by category, I can do that. He turned around. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual for her. You can do that, he said. The accounting work. I've been managing supply budgets for 19 years. Yes, I can do the accounting work. Who taught you? Nobody, she said. I taught myself because it was useful and nobody else was doing it correctly. She held his gaze. The question is whether you want the complete picture or whether you'd rather I put this back on the shelf and focus on the cooking. He came back to the table. He sat down. He looked at both ledgers again, and then he looked at her. I want the complete picture, he said. She nodded once. Then I'll need access to all the supply records, not just the kitchen accounts. Feed equipment, lumber, anything that comes through Harlan's operation. I'll get them after breakfast. Good. She stood up and moved back to the stove. Breakfast is in 40 minutes. The ranch hands came in with the particular energized hunger of men who had eaten well the night before and were arriving with expectations for the first time in months. Abigail fed them without ceremony. Eggs, biscuits, gravy made from the drippings of last night's beef coffee that was strong without being punishing, and watched the table the way she always watched a table, reading the atmosphere of the crew in the way food consumption reveals it. Who ate fast and who ate slowly, who talked and who was quiet, who deferred to whom when there was one biscuit left in the basket. A man named Hector, who appeared to be the senior hand based on where he sat and how the others oriented toward him without quite being aware they were doing it, waited until most of the men had cleared out and then brought his empty plate to the counter and said, Ma'am, I want you to know that's the best breakfast I've had since February. February? She said. We had a ranch cook from up near Casper for 3 weeks in February. He left when the weather turned. Hector set the plate down with the careful courtesy of a man who'd been raised to treat a woman's kitchen with respect. Before that, it was mostly Walt burning things. From across the room, Walt said with sincere dignity, I do my best. Your best, said a young man named Charlie, is beans that taste like the pot. That's because it's a good pot. Abigail said, I'll need someone to tell me what the feed situation looks like this week. For the cattle. Hector and Walt exchanged a look that lasted about half a second too long. What? She said. Hector turned back to her. We've been having some trouble with the cattle, ma'am. They've been losing weight. Silas has been trying to figure out why, thought it was the drought conditions, the grass being poor this summer. But even when we supplement with purchased feed, they're not holding weight the way they should. Abigail set down the pan she was holding. Where does the feed come from? Harlan Trading, Hector said. Same as everything else. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, Thank you, Hector. When Silas came back to the kitchen with the full set of supply records, 4 years of invoices bound in 3 ledger books with frayed covers, Abigail was ready for him with the kitchen table cleared and her pencils arranged and a fresh sheet of paper ruled into columns. He set the ledgers down, looked at her setup, and said nothing about it. She worked through the morning while the ranch operated around her. Silas came and went, and twice he brought her a cup of coffee without being asked, which she registered as an act of practical consideration rather than courtesy for its own sake, meaning he understood that a person doing concentrated analytical work does not need interruption, but does need fuel. That was a rare quality in an employer. By noon, she had a preliminary picture. By early afternoon, it had become something else entirely. She set her pencil down. She sat for a moment completely still. Then she went to find Silas Reed. He was at the corral watching one of the hands work a young horse, and when he saw her face, he excused himself immediately and came to her without being asked. Tell me, he said. It's not just the kitchen supplies, she said. Come and look at the feed records. They sat together at the kitchen table, and she walked him through it with the patience and precision she used when the information was complicated and the stakes were high. The feed invoices showed the same overcharge pattern as the kitchen supplies consistent calculated running across multiple years. But the feed records showed something additional, something that had taken her longer to identify because she'd needed to cross-reference the purchase volumes against the cattle weight records Silas kept separately. "The volumes are right," she said. "You've been buying the right amount of feed for your herd size, but your cattle are losing weight on it." She looked at him. "Silas, what if the feed isn't what the invoices say it is?" He went very still. "You're supplementing with a grain mix," she said. "Look at the weight records from 18 months ago versus now. Same herd size, same feeding schedule, dramatically different weight retention. The difference began." She pointed to the date, 6 months after Harlan's price increases started. "You think the feed is diluted? I think the feed may be significantly less nutritious than what you're paying for," she said. "Whether it's diluted deliberately or substituted with lower quality material, I can't tell you from records alone. You'd need to have it tested. But the correlation between the feed purchase pattern and the cattle weight loss is not coincidental." She paused. "And if the same thing is happening to other ranches in this valley who use Harlan Trading as their primary supplier?" "They all do," Silas said. His voice had gone very quiet. "Every operation in this valley uses Harlan for at least 60% of their supplies. He's the only trading operation within reasonable distance with the volume to serve us all." Abigail nodded once. "Then this isn't a problem specific to Red Canyon Ranch." He stood up, walked 3 steps, turned around. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he was holding something very controlled in place, and she respected him considerably for it, because the alternative, which would have been legitimate, was to put his fist through the wall. "How long," he said, "do you think this has been running? Based on the records you have, the overcharging at minimum 4 years, possibly longer. The feed issue, I think, closer to 18 months to 2 years, based on when the weight records start showing the deviation." She met his eyes. "Silas, if this has been running 4 years across the majority of operations in this valley, we're talking about a scheme that has extracted an enormous amount of money from this entire community. And if ranches have been failing sales foreclosures, families leaving. 3, he said flatly. 3 operations in this valley sold out in the last 2 years. Men I've known my whole life. Said they couldn't make the numbers work anymore. Drought, they said. Bad years." He stopped. His voice was very controlled and very quiet. "It wasn't bad years." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Then Abigail said, "No, it wasn't." He looked at her. Something was working in his expression that she recognized, because she had seen it before in people who were rearranging a large and important understanding, the simultaneous grief and fury of realizing that something you blamed on the indifferent cruelty of nature was in fact the deliberate cruelty of a person who made a choice. "We need evidence," he said. "Not just my records. We need records from the other ranches, and we need someone to test that feed." "Yes. Will you help me put it together?" She looked at him steadily. "That's not what you hired me for." "I know it isn't." He held her gaze. "I'm asking anyway." Outside, a horse made a sound in the corral, and one of the hands called out something to another, the ordinary sounds of a working ranch in the afternoon. Abigail looked at the ledgers spread across the table, at the columns of figures she'd spent the day translating into truth, at the picture of deliberate systematic theft, laid out in ink across 4 years of someone else's careful records. She thought about 11 doors. She thought about the foreman in Nebraska who had adjusted the receipts and the owner who had believed her. She thought about what it meant that nobody in this valley had seen what she had seen in less than 1 day, because nobody in this valley had been looking with her particular combination of knowledge and precision, and the perfectly ordinary professional habit of keeping careful records. "Yes," she said. "I'll help you." He nodded. There was something in his face that was not relief exactly. It was more specific than relief, more directed, but she didn't examine it closely. "Tomorrow," she said, standing up. "Tonight I need to cook supper for 11 men, and you need to get word to some of the other ranchers, quietly. Don't tell them why, yet just find out if anyone else has been noticing their cattle losing weight." He was already moving toward the door. He stopped. "Miss Carter," he said without turning around. "Those 11 places today, their loss." She picked up her pencil and did not respond, because responding would have required her to acknowledge something she wasn't ready to examine, yet the strange, unsteady feeling of being seen clearly by someone who had absolutely no reason to look. Victor Harland found out she was at Red Canyon Ranch before the week was out. She didn't know that yet, but by Friday afternoon, a man she didn't recognize rode slowly past the ranch entrance twice, and Hector mentioned it to Silas in a tone that suggested it wasn't the first time that it happened, and Silas mentioned it to Abigail in a tone that suggested he wanted her to know without wanting to alarm her. And Abigail filed it in the same careful mental ledger where she filed everything that might become important later. She kept cooking. She kept working on the accounts. She kept asking quiet, precise questions. And Victor Harland, 6 miles away in his trading office, began making plans of his own. The rider came back on Saturday. Not the same man as before. This one was heavier, with a bay horse that had been ridden hard, and he didn't slow down at the gate. He came straight into the yard at a pace that brought Hector out of the barn and 2 other hands to the fence before the man had even dismounted. Abigail was in the kitchen and heard the hoofbeats change and walked to the window without thinking, the way she had learned to track sounds that didn't fit the ordinary rhythm of a working ranch. The man asked for Silas Reed by name. He got him. She couldn't hear what was said in the yard, but she watched Silas's posture change across the 30 seconds of conversation, watched him go from the relaxed attention of a man receiving ordinary news to something straighter and more guarded, and when the rider left and Silas came inside, she was already at the table with her hands around her coffee cup waiting. "That was a message from Gerald Purvis," Silas said. "He runs the Purvis operation 2 valleys over. His foreman told him he'd heard from someone in town that I was having financial difficulties, that I might be looking to sell." Abigail set her cup down very carefully. "Who told his foreman that?" "The foreman said he heard it at Harland's trading post." Silas pulled out a chair and sat. His jaw was working. "Harland told at least 3 people this week that Red Canyon Ranch is struggling, that I'm in over my head, that the drought has hit me worse than anyone's admitting." "That's not information," Abigail said. "That's a campaign." He looked at her. "He knows you're looking at the accounts," she said. "Someone told him you've been asking questions, or he saw it another way. Maybe the feed order you adjusted last week, maybe the supply list you didn't send. Something changed in your purchasing pattern and he noticed." She kept her voice even because one of them needed to be even. "He's getting ahead of it. If he can establish that you're financially unstable before you can establish that he's been stealing from you, then anything you bring forward looks like desperation rather than evidence." Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's been doing this a long time." "Yes." "He knows exactly how to do it." "Yes." He pressed both hands flat on the table, looked at them, and then looked up at her. "How far along are we?" "I have your records complete," she said. 4 years every category. The overcharge documentation is solid. I can show the variance against market rate for every commodity month by month. The feed analysis is circumstantial until we get a chemical test, but the weight correlation is clear enough that any reasonable person will understand what it implies. She paused. "The problem is that my documentation of your ranch alone, while it's damning, is the account of one operation. Harland will say your records are unusual. He'll say you had other inefficiencies. He'll find a way to make it specific to you rather than systemic. We need the other ranches." "We need the other ranches," she confirmed. "And we need them quickly. Because now that he started this, the rumors, the instability story that's going to spread. And once people in this valley believe you're going under, the banks will pull back, the suppliers will demand cash forward, and the rumor becomes self-fulfilling." Silas stood up. He moved with the contained energy of a man who has been sitting still when everything in him wants to move. "I've got contacts at 4 other operations: Caldwell Brennan, the Morrison brothers, old Tom Ferris at the Ferris Creek spread. I need to talk to all of them this week." "Don't tell them what you have yet," Abigail said. "Ask them about the cattle first. Ask about the feed. If they're seeing the same weight problems, they'll already be suspicious and they'll be ready to listen. If you lead with the financial fraud, they'll be defensive. Nobody wants to hear they've been cheated for years without a chance to arrive at it themselves. He looked at her with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was hearing something that was obviously correct and was adjusting his intended approach accordingly without making anything of the adjustment. "You've done this before. I've handled supply disputes before," she said. "This is larger, but the human element is the same." She met his eyes. "Silas? What Harland is doing right now, the rumors he's going to accelerate that. He's going to make sure the Valley hears that you're finished before you can make the Valley hear the truth. So you have approximately 1 week, maybe 2, before public opinion becomes a problem we can't account for in a supply ledger." He nodded once. He was already thinking ahead. She could see it running through the logistics of 4 ranch visits, the order in which to make them, what to say. This was a man who, when confronted with a problem, moved toward it rather than away from it. She had cataloged this quality in him over the past 6 days, with the same careful attention she applied to everything she considered worth understanding. "I'll ride to Caldwell's today," he said. "Morrison Brothers tomorrow. Can you manage here without me for 2 days?" "I've managed operations for 40 men without supervision," she said. "Yes, Mr. Reed, I can manage." He almost smiled. It was becoming familiar, that almost smile, the one that arrived and departed quickly, as if he wasn't entirely sure it was appropriate yet. "I'll be back by Tuesday. I'll have the full comparative analysis ready when you are." He left within the hour. The ranch ran as it always ran, Hector in charge of the hands, the work proceeding with the solid, unremarkable rhythm of a crew that knew its tasks. Abigail cooked and worked the accounts and said very little to anyone, and on Sunday morning, when she went to check the feed storage herself, she found what she had been looking for without quite letting herself expect it. She knew grain. She had been purchasing and managing grain stores for 19 years. She knew what a proper corn and oat mix smelled like, what it looked like when poured through the hand, the weight and texture and color of feed. That was what it claimed to be. She knelt in the storage barn and took a fistful of the current supply and held it in her palm and looked at it for a long time, and then brought it close and breathed it in. The color was slightly wrong. Not dramatically, not obviously, not to someone who wasn't looking for it. But the ratio of corn to fill material was off. Something had been mixed in, probably low-quality chaff, possibly worse, in a proportion carefully calculated to be undetectable by a casual examination, but significant enough across months of feeding to produce exactly the weight loss the herd had been showing. She sealed a portion in a cloth bag, labeled it with the date and the invoice number of the most recent Harlan delivery, and stored it in her recipe chest between the oilcloth-wrapped knives and the spice tin. She went back to the kitchen and made Sunday dinner. Walt came to the counter after the meal, ostensibly to return his plate. But actually she had determined, because Walt used the plate return as social cover for conversation he wanted to have, but wouldn't initiate directly. She had observed this about him and found it endearing in the specific way that the transparent behavioral strategies of honest people tend to be endearing. "Something going on with Silas," he said with studied casualness. "He's visiting neighboring operations," she said. "That rider Saturday," Walt said. "And Hector's got that look." "What look?" "The one where he knows something's wrong and he's deciding whether to tell us." Walt set his plate on the counter. "Ma'am, we're not simple men. We know this ranch has been struggling. We know Silas has been worried. And we know you've been sitting at that table with the account books every morning for a week." He paused. "Whatever's happening, we're with him. I want you to know that. Every man here. We don't leave when it gets hard." Abigail looked at him for a moment. Something moved in her chest that she was careful not to let reach her face. "I'll tell him you said that," she said. "Good." He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "That cornbread today, ma'am? I don't know how you do what you do with a pan and some flour, but it's a genuine gift." After he left, she stood at the counter for a moment with her hands braced on the wood and the kitchen quiet around her, and she thought about 11 doors and about the particular loneliness of being capable in a world that has already decided not to look at you, and about what it meant to find yourself at 41 years old in a kitchen that felt, despite everything, despite the danger building outside the ranch perimeter, and the ledgers full of evidence of deliberate theft, and the rumors spreading through the valley like groundwater, like a place she might belong. She straightened up. She picked up her pencil. She had work to do. Silas came back Tuesday afternoon 3 hours earlier than she'd expected. He came through the kitchen door without preamble and said, "Caldwell has the same weight problem. Has for 18 months. He thought it was his herd's age." He sat down heavily. Morrison Brothers lost 1,100 pounds of cattle value last year. They blamed the drought and sold off 2 sections of land to cover it. The land they sold went to a holding company at below market value. He stopped. Morrison said the holding company representative came to them through Harlan's trading post. Harlan connected the buyer to the seller. The kitchen went very still. "He's not just stealing from the supply chain," Abigail said. "He's engineering the failures," Silas said. "He starves the operations, undercuts their revenue, then connects the desperate seller with his buyer at a price that benefits nobody but the buyer." He looked at her. "He's been consolidating land in this valley for 2 years, using the fraudulent supply scheme to weaken ranches, then picking up the pieces through intermediaries." Abigail felt the full shape of it settle into place. She had seen the financial component and understood it as serious. This was something beyond serious. This was a systematic predatory operation designed not merely to steal money, but to dismantle the economic foundation of an entire community and replace it with concentrated ownership under a single controlling entity. "Tom Ferris," she said. "Did you get to him?" Silas's expression shifted in a way that told her the answer before he spoke. "Ferris Creek is already gone. Tom sold 3 weeks ago. I didn't know. His wife told me. She said they had no choice. The ranch wasn't producing, the cattle were failing, the bank was pressing them." His voice was controlled and quiet, in the way she had come to understand meant he was holding something very large in check. Tom and Agnes Ferris lived on that land for 31 years. Abigail said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The county has a land records office." "Yes." "The sale of Ferris Creek will be documented. The buyer, the price, the date. If there's a pattern of acquisition, multiple properties below market, connected through common intermediaries, that's evidence of a coordinated scheme, not individual transactions." She looked at him steadily. "This is bigger than a supply fraud case. This is something the Territorial Land Authority needs to see. We need more than the records," he said. "We need people willing to testify. And right now Harlan's been telling the valley that I'm the problem, that I'm failing, that anything I say is a desperate man trying to shift blame." He leaned forward. "Yesterday in Dry Creek, Mrs. Alderman, she's been in this valley 40 years. Everyone respects her. She told Caldwell that she'd heard I'd hired some woman from nowhere to manage my books because I'd lost control of my own operation. That's Harlan's version of you, Abigail, already in circulation. She felt it land. She'd known it would come. Eventually it always came. The reduction, the dismissal, the framing of a competent woman's presence as evidence of a man's weakness, rather than a reasonable professional decision. She had felt it before, and she knew how to carry it without letting it change anything she intended to do. "Let him frame it however he wants," she said. "The numbers don't change based on how he describes me." "I know that," Silas said, "and the directness of it, the complete absence of any qualification or hesitation, was the kind of thing she still wasn't quite used to from him. But we have to move faster than his version of events." "Then we move faster," she said. "I need you to get me the feed test results. Is there a chemist or an agrarian expert in the county who can analyze a feed sample?" He thought for a moment. "There's a man in Casper, Dr. Elliot Marsh. He consults for the Territorial Agricultural Board. Can you get a sample to him this week?" "I'll go myself if I have to." "Go yourself," she said. "And take 2 samples, one from the current Harlan delivery, and one from the reserve stock you had before the weight problem started, if any of it is still sealed. The comparison will be more compelling than a single test." She stood up and retrieved the cloth bag from the recipe chest. "This is from Sunday, labeled with the invoice number." He took it from her. Their hands were close for a moment, and she was aware of it, the way she was aware of the stove's warmth and the angle of the afternoon light peripherally precisely, and without letting the awareness alter her expression. "Abigail," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss. She registered it, but did not respond to it except to keep looking at him with the same level attention she always gave. "I want you to know," he said, "that when this is over, when we've got this in front of whoever needs to see it, I intend to make clear to everyone in this valley exactly whose work made it possible." "That isn't necessary," she said. "Maybe not necessary," he said, "but true." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly professional, and then she turned back to the stove because supper wasn't going to cook itself, and because some things needed to be set aside for later examination, placed on a shelf, in a careful corner of the mind. The way you place something fragile that you intend to return to when you have sufficient time to be appropriately careful with it. Harland moved on Wednesday, not a rider this time. A letter delivered by the Dry Creek postmaster's son directly to Silas Reed, typed on Harland Trading Company letterhead, formally notifying him that due to irregular payment patterns and concerns regarding the financial stability of Red Canyon Ranch, Harland Trading was suspending all credit arrangements effective immediately and requiring payment in full within 30 days for all outstanding balances, or the matter would be referred to the county banking authority. Silas read the letter at the kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he set it down and said nothing. Abigail picked it up and read it. "The outstanding balance," she said. "What is it?" $412. "Which you have." "Which I have, but he doesn't know that with certainty, and if the banking authority gets a referral suggesting I'm defaulting on commercial debts, the bank will call my land note." He looked at the letter. "He's trying to trigger a bank action before we can get the evidence together." "How long do we have before the bank acts on a referral?" 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I can speak to the manager directly and explain the situation. "Then you speak to the bank manager tomorrow," she said. "Bring the overcharge documentation. Not everything, just enough to establish that your financial difficulties are the result of a fraudulent supply arrangement, not your own mismanagement. You're not asking the bank to take your side. You're asking them to wait." She put the letter down. "Can you pay the $412? "Yes. Pay it Monday. Don't give him the payment default argument." She looked at him. "And I need you to call the ranchers together. Caldwell Morrison, anyone else you trust. This week, not next. If Harland is escalating, we don't have the time we thought we had." He nodded. He was looking at her with that expression again, the specific directed one she still hadn't fully named, and she met it squarely and said nothing. "Saturday," he said. "I can get them to Saturday." "Then Saturday," she said. "I'll have everything ready." That night, after the ranch was quiet and the lamp was burning low, Abigail sat at the small table in her room and looked at the complete document she had assembled over 10 days, 4 years of receipts. The market comparisons, the feed evidence, the weight correlation, the pattern of land sales connected through Harland's operation, and she thought about what it would mean to stand in a room full of ranchers, most of whom had already heard Harland's version of what she was, and present this. She had stood in rooms like that before. She knew what it cost. She knew how the faces looked at the beginning. The polite skepticism. The waiting for her to fail. The particular quality of attention that is less listening than it is watching for the moment when you prove that the thing they assumed about you was right all along. She also knew what it looked like when the numbers were undeniable. She picked up her pencil. She had 3 days. 3 days was not enough time, and also exactly enough time because Abigail Carter had spent 19 years learning to work within whatever time she was given without complaint and without waste. She slept 4 hours Thursday night and 3 on Friday, and she did not mention this to anyone. She organized the documentation into a sequence that told a story. Not because she was trying to be theatrical about it, but because she had learned that truth presented as a pile of evidence asks its audience to do the work of understanding, while truth presented as a narrative does the work for them. And when your audience is a room full of exhausted, angry ranchers who have been cheated for years without knowing it, you do not ask them to do additional work. She organized it like this. First, the market prices, because everyone in that room would know instinctively whether the figures were right. Second, the Harland invoices against those prices. because the gap between what things cost and what they were charged would land immediately and personally. Third, the feed analysis, because the cattle were the rancher's livelihood, and the betrayal of the feed was the most visceral part of the scheme. Fourth, the land sales, because the full picture of what Harland had been building toward was something no one in that room had yet seen assembled in one place. And Abigail understood that people who have been individually wronged sometimes need to see the collective shape of the wrong before they can move from personal anger into the kind of unified action that actually accomplishes something. Silas came back from the bank on Thursday evening and sat down at the kitchen table and said he listened. "Good," she said, without looking up from the document she was collating. He said he'd hold the referral pending a full accounting review. He wants documentation of the supply fraud by the end of the month. He'll have it. Silas was quiet for a moment. He also said he'd received a visit from Harland himself 2 days ago. Harland told him the same story he's been telling everyone, that I'm struggling, that I've brought in outside help because I can't manage my own operation, that he's concerned about the viability of my loan. He paused. The bank manager said Harland seemed very well informed about my financial situation. Abigail set down her pencil. How well informed? He knew the approximate amount of my outstanding balance with Harland Trading. He knew I'd adjusted my feed order last month. He knew you were here. Silas's voice was controlled and deliberate. He knows things that aren't public knowledge. Who has access to your ranch accounts besides you? Nobody. Me and whoever I show them to. Then he has a source, she said. Someone who has been reporting your operational details to him. Not guessing reporting. She picked up her pencil again. Think about who has been to the ranch in the last month. Deliveries, visitors, anyone who came through the yard. Silas thought. She could see him working through it. His jaw set, his eyes moving to the middle distance, the way a person's eyes do when they're sorting through memory. Then something shifted in his face. The Harland delivery boy, he said slowly. He comes twice a month. Young kid, 17 maybe? He always comes to the kitchen door. Abigail looked at him. He's been talking to you, Silas said. Or watching, or both. He asked me last week how long I'd been keeping the books, she said. I thought he was making conversation. She kept her voice level. I told him I was just helping with the kitchen inventory, but he would have seen the ledgers on the table. Silas stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she gave him the moment because she could feel the anger radiating off him with a very specific quality, not at her, but at the situation, at the violation of it, at the fact that a 17-year-old boy had been used as an instrument of surveillance against him in his own home. He's a kid, Silas said finally. He probably doesn't even know what he's reporting is being used this way. Probably not, she agreed. Which doesn't change what it means for us. She paused. Don't confront him. Don't change your behavior with him. If Harland thinks his information source is still active, he'll be less inclined to move before Saturday. If he realizes the channel is cut, he'll accelerate. Silas turned around. You think like someone who's been in difficult situations before. I've been in difficult situations before, she said simply. Saturday. Can you still get them all there? Caldwell confirmed this morning. Morrison Brothers said yes. I've got 2 more, a man named Aldridge from the North Valley and Pete Rourke from the Creek operation. Rourke's been suspicious of his feed for months, but didn't know who to talk to. He looked at her. 6 ranchers. Is that enough? It's enough to start, she said. If we can get those 6 to agree on a joint complaint to the Territorial Land Authority and the County Trade Committee, that's a formal investigation. And a formal investigation changes everything, because Harland can't manage a formal investigation the way he manages rumors. He'll try to discredit you, Silas said. It was direct and without cushioning, which she appreciated. Before Saturday. During. He'll make it about you specifically, who you are, where you came from, why anyone should listen to a woman who nobody in this valley knew 3 weeks ago. I know, she said. Does that change anything? She looked at him steadily. Not a single figure in those ledgers. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded, and there was something in the nod that was more than agreement. It was a particular kind of recognition, the kind that lands differently than a compliment, that means something more durable than approval. Saturday arrived cold and clear with a wind coming down from the mountains that had an early autumn edge to it, despite being only August. The ranchers came by mid-morning, riding in ones and twos, and Abigail watched them arrive from the kitchen and assessed each one with the same rapid precision she applied to everything. She observed their posture, how they greeted Silas, the degree of tension in their shoulders, which ones looked worried, and which ones looked angry, and which ones were trying to look like neither. The Morrison brothers arrived together and were clearly angry. Tom Caldwell arrived alone and looked like a man who had been carrying a weight he didn't have words for. Aldridge was guarded. Pete Rourke looked scared. Silas set them up in the main room with coffee and said very little by way of preamble, because he had listened when she told him not to front-load the meeting with explanation, let the evidence arrive before the interpretation. Then he brought her in. She could feel it the moment she walked through the door, the particular atmospheric shift that happens when a room full of men recalibrates its attention to account for the presence of a woman in a context where they weren't expecting to be required to take one seriously. She had walked into that shift so many times that it had lost the power to make her falter. She simply noted it, the way you note the temperature of a room, and adjusted accordingly. She set the document on the table. She did not sit down. "My name is Abigail Carter," she said. "I've managed supply accounts for ranch and mining operations in Wyoming and Nebraska for 19 years. 3 weeks ago, Mr. Reed hired me to manage his kitchen. What I found in his supply records is why you're here today." She looked at each man, once briefly establishing the fact of her attention without asking for theirs. "I'm going to show you your money. Then I'm going to show you where it went." Tom Caldwell leaned forward slightly. That was the first signal. She moved through it exactly as she had organized it, and she did not rush, and she did not elaborate beyond what the figures required, because the figures were doing the work, and the worst thing she could do was get between them and the men in the room. When she laid the market price comparison against the Harland invoice prices, she saw Pete Rourke's face change not dramatically, but in the specific way a person's face changes when they recognize the shape of something they've been feeling without being able to name. "That can't be right," Rourke said about the flour overcharge. Not aggressive, genuinely disbelieving in the way of a person who needs a moment to accept what they're looking at. "The market price is sourced from the Territorial Agricultural Board's quarterly reports," she said, and turned the page toward him. "The reference is there. You can verify it independently." He looked at it. He didn't say anything else. When she got to the feed analysis, the room changed temperature. "The feed you've been purchasing from Harlan Trading," she said, "has been adulterated. The corn-to-fill ratio in the current supply averages approximately 60% of what the invoice specifies. I have a sample from the current Harlan delivery at Red Canyon Ranch." She set the labeled cloth bag on the table. "I have also sent a sample to Dr. Elliot Marsh in Casper for chemical analysis. Those results are expected within 10 days. She paused deliberately. "But you don't need a chemist to confirm the adulteration. You need to look at your cattle." The older Morrison brother said in a voice that was very quiet, 1,100 pounds. "Yes," she said. "That's the weight loss you reported. And you sold land to cover it." She turned to the next document. "The land you sold went to a holding company called Meridian Land Associates. The purchase was arranged through Harlan's trading post. The sale price was 31% below the assessed value of that land." She set the land records on the table. "Meridian Land Associates has acquired 4 properties in this valley in the past 2 years. All 4 sales were facilitated through Harlan Trading. All 4 sellers reported operational difficulties in the 12 to 18 months preceding the sale. Difficulties I can now demonstrate were directly caused by Harlan's supply fraud." The room was completely silent. Then Aldridge, who had been guarded and silent since he arrived, said Ferris Creek. "Yes," she said. "Tom and Agnes Ferris, 31 years." Something moved through the room, not sound, not movement, but a collective shift in the quality of attention. A hardening that was grief and fury arriving simultaneously in 6 different men and finding the same form. The younger Morrison brother stood up. He didn't say anything, just stood, which was its own kind of statement. "What do we do?" Caldwell said. "You file a joint complaint," she said, "to the Territorial Land Authority and the County Trade Committee simultaneously. The joint nature of the complaint is essential. It establishes the systemic pattern rather than individual grievance. I've drafted the complaint document." She set it on the table. It references the supply records, the feed analysis, and the land acquisition pattern. It names Harlan Trading Company and requests a formal investigation into both the commercial fraud and the land acquisition scheme. She looked around the table. "Every man who signs it is going on record. I want you to understand that before anyone picks up a pen." "What about Harlan?" Rourke said. He was still scared she could see it. "He hears about this before it's filed. He'll come after every one of us, the way he came after Silas." "He'll hear about it eventually regardless," she said. "The question is whether you're standing together when he does, or standing separately." She paused. "He has spent 4 years managing you one at a time. That's his system. Isolated, you're each a problem he can solve. Together, you're a problem he cannot." She let that sit for a moment. Then Caldwell picked up the pen. He signed without ceremony, without a speech, just signed his name, with the deliberate steadiness of a man who has made up his mind and is done with uncertainty. The older Morrison brother signed next, then the younger. Aldridge looked at the document for a long moment, then signed. Rourke took the longest. She watched him breathe through it, watched him make the decision with his whole body, and then he signed. 6 signatures. Silas signed last. He looked up at her when he set the pen down, and she held his gaze for precisely long enough to acknowledge what had just happened. And then she picked up the document and set it carefully in the folder that would go to Casper with the morning stage. Then Victor Harland walked through the door. Not literally, not him in person. But his messenger arrived at the yard while the ranchers were still inside, and the message was not a letter this time. It was a man named Goss, who worked for Harlan's legal representative in Cheyenne, and Goss handed Silas Reed a formal notice on legal letterhead stating that Harlan Trading Company was initiating a civil debt proceeding against Red Canyon Ranch for what the notice described as breach of commercial contract and deliberate obstruction of legitimate business operations. Silas read the notice in the doorway of the main room with 5 other ranchers watching him, and then he looked at Abigail. She held out her hand. He gave her the notice. She read it. "Breach of commercial contract," she said. "The contract breach he's citing is the adjusted feed order. You reduced your feed purchase last month because the cattle weren't gaining weight on it. He's arguing that constitutes breach." She looked up. "This is not a strong legal position. This is a pressure tactic. He wants a legal proceeding on record against you before you can file the complaint, so that when you file the complaint, it looks retaliatory." "Can he do that?" Aldridge said. "He can file the proceeding," she said. "Whether it succeeds is a different question." She set the notice on the table beside the signed complaint. "It doesn't change the complaint. It makes filing it faster rather than slower, because you want the joint complaint in Casper before any proceeding against Silas is established in the county records." "The stage leaves tomorrow morning," Silas said. "Then someone needs to be on it tonight." She looked at him. "You need to be on it. Your presence in Casper when the complaint is filed matters. It's not a woman's account or a ranch hand's account. It's you, the primary property holder, presenting evidence of fraud alongside the documentation." She paused. "I'll stay here and manage the ranch until you're back." Something moved across his face that she didn't examine. "You'd stay," he said. "I work here," she said. "Yes, I'd stay." Caldwell stood up. "I'll ride with you," he said to Silas. "2 of us showing up together is better than 1. The older Morrison brother said, "We'll come too." Within the hour, the room had reorganized itself from a meeting into a departure, and Abigail managed the logistics of 4 men preparing to ride to the stage station with the same calm efficiency she applied to feeding 11 ranch hands on a Tuesday morning. She packed what Silas would need, the full document folder, the complaint, the ledger copies, the feed sample, and she did it without being asked because the situation required it, and she was the person who could see most clearly what the situation required. Silas came to the kitchen to collect the folder and found her sealing the last envelope. "Abigail," he said. She looked up. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. She had noticed he always held his hat when he spoke to her, the same small, deliberate gesture of respect she had registered the first day at the water trough, and he looked at her with the expression she had been not examining for 3 weeks, the one that was specific and directed, and had a quality she recognized from the part of herself she had long since agreed to set aside. "When I come back," he said, "I want to talk to you. Not about the ranch, not about the accounts." He paused. "About other things." She held his gaze. Something in her chest did something she was not going to acknowledge until later, until she had sufficient time to be careful with it. "Come back first," she said. He put his hat on. He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." She listened to the horses leave the yard, and then she turned back to the kitchen, and she let herself feel for exactly 30 seconds before she locked it away and got back to work. The terrifying and completely unfamiliar sensation of having something worth hoping for. Then she picked up her pencil. There was still work to do. Silas was gone 4 days. Abigail knew because she counted them the way she counted everything. Precisely without sentiment, with the full awareness that counting was a way of managing the space between what had been said and what had not yet been resolved. She fed the men. She kept the accounts. She checked the cattle every morning with Hector, who had stopped pretending he didn't know something significant was happening, and had simply folded himself into the situation with the quiet loyalty she had come to expect from him. On the second day, a man came to the ranch gate and asked for Silas Reed. When Hector told him Silas was away, the man asked who was managing the property. Hector said the ranch manager was unavailable. The man left without leaving his name, and Abigail, who had watched the exchange from the kitchen doorway, wrote down the description of the man and his horse in the margin of her working notes with the date and time, because she had learned that the things you record without knowing why you're recording them are often the things you need later. On the third day, a letter arrived from Harlan Trading Company, addressed to Silas Reed and marked urgent. She set it on the kitchen table unopened and looked at it for a long moment, and then left it exactly where it was, because it was not her letter to open, and because whatever was in it could wait for the person it was written to. On the fourth day in the late afternoon, she heard hoofbeats in the yard that she recognized by rhythm before she reached the window. Silas came through the kitchen door with Caldwell behind him, and both of them carrying the particular quality of exhaustion that belongs to men who have done something that required everything they had and are only now allowing themselves to feel the weight of it. She had coffee on the table before either of them sat down. Silas looked at her. "It's filed," he said. "The Territorial Land Authority and the County Trade Committee, simultaneously like you said." He sat. "Marcia's chemical analysis came through while we were in Casper. The feed sample you took, the corn content tested at 58% of invoice specification. He put it in writing on official board letterhead." He set the document on the table. "That's not a variance. That's deliberate adulteration, and he said so in the report." Caldwell wrapped both hands around his coffee cup and said, "The Land Authority clerk, when we laid it all out, the supply records, the feed analysis, the land acquisition pattern." She stopped writing her notes and just looked at us for a moment. Then she said, "How long has this been running?" And when we told her, she called in her supervisor. "They're sending an investigator," Silas said, "within 2 weeks. They want all the original documents held at the county seat, not the ranch, so they're protected from any interference." He looked at her. "They asked who compiled the analysis. I told them. They want a formal statement from you." Abigail nodded once. "I'll give them whatever they need." "There's more," Caldwell said. He glanced at Silas, who nodded. "While we were at the Land Authority, the clerk pulled the Meridian Land Associates registration. You were right about the pattern, 4 properties in 2 years. But when they traced the registration back through the territorial business filings..." He stopped, looked at his cup. "Harland is Meridian. It's his company. Registered under his wife's maiden name, but the signature on the original filing is his. He's been buying the land himself." The kitchen was very quiet. "He wasn't just extracting money," Abigail said. He was building an empire, Silas said. He wanted to own the valley. Not just supply it. Own it. His voice was controlled and very flat. Tom Ferris's land, the land that the Morrison brothers sold, all of it going into his private holdings while he smiled at us across the trading post counter. She let the full weight of it sit for a moment, because it deserved to be sat with the scale of the deliberate predation, the patience of it, the years it had taken, and the lives it had quietly destroyed. Then she picked up the unopened letter from Harlan Trading and handed it to Silas. He opened it. He read it. His expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it settled into a kind of cold clarity. "He's withdrawing the civil debt proceeding," he said. "The letter says Harlan Trading Company has reviewed its records and determined that the proceeding was filed in error." He set it down. "He knows we filed. He's cutting his losses." "He knows it's over," she said. "He doesn't know it's over," Silas said. "He thinks if he withdraws the proceeding and stays quiet, the investigation will stall without his active opposition. He thinks the territorial authority moves slowly enough that he can manage the outcome." He looked at her. "He doesn't know what we have. He doesn't know about the feed analysis. He doesn't know about the Meridian registration." "He'll know soon enough," Caldwell said. He finished his coffee and stood up. "I'm going home to tell my wife. She's been worried for 3 days. He put on his hat. "Miss Carter." He stopped at the door and turned back to look at her with the specific expression of a man who has been wrong about something and is acknowledging it without making a production of it. "I'll admit I wasn't sure what to make of you when I walked in here Saturday. I want you to know I was wrong about that." He nodded once. "Good evening." He left. His hoofbeats faded across the yard. The kitchen was quiet in the way it gets in the last hour before supper when the ranch outside is still active, but the interior has a particular lull, and the stove ticks gently with residual heat, and the light through the east window has gone from gold to the softer gray of early evening. Silas did not move to leave. He sat with both hands around his empty coffee cup and looked at the table, and Abigail sat across from him and did not fill the silence, because she could feel that he was working toward something, and the appropriate response was patience. Finally he said, "When I was in Casper, I kept thinking about what you said, about 11 doors. She looked at him. "I kept thinking about the fact that you walked into this valley with $40 in a recipe chest, and they turned you away 11 times, and then you sat down by a water trough and said something honest that you'd probably never said out loud before, and I happened to hear it." He looked up. "And now, because of that, because of one overheard sentence, we have a chance to hold accountable a man who has been destroying this community for 4 years. That's not because of the sentence," she said. "That's because of the 19 years of work that gave me the knowledge to recognize what the ledgers were showing." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I mean." He set the cup down. He looked at her directly, without the almost smile, without the careful professional distance he had maintained for 4 weeks. "Abigail, I told you before I left that I wanted to talk to you about other things when I came back." "I remember," she said. "I'm back," he said. The kitchen held the quality of silence that precedes something that cannot be unsaid, and Abigail felt it the way she felt changes in weather in the body, first before the mind has finished deciding what to do about it. "I'm not a man who talks around things," Silas said. "So I'm going to say it plainly. I hired you because I needed a cook, and you were there, and you were clearly capable. What I did not anticipate—" He stopped, started again. "What I did not anticipate was that you would show me inside of 4 weeks what it looks like when someone runs directly toward a problem instead of managing it from a safe distance. What it looks like when someone does the right thing because it's the right thing, and not because anyone's watching." He paused. "I didn't anticipate that I would start looking for reasons to be in the kitchen when the cooking was already done." Abigail was very still. "I'm not asking you to answer something you're not ready to answer," he said. "I'm asking you to know that what I feel isn't about what you did for this ranch. It's not gratitude. I know the difference." His voice was steady and certain in the way of a man who has thought something through completely and is done with uncertainty about it. "It's you, who you are, the way you think, The way you don't ask anyone's permission to be exactly as capable as you are." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Hector called something to Walt across the yard, and a horse responded with the particular sound horses make when they're being led to water, and the ordinary life of the ranch continued its ordinary motion around the two people sitting at the kitchen table, who were in the middle of something that was not ordinary at all. She had built her life on honesty. She had organized 19 years around the principle that the truth stated plainly was more valuable than any comfortable management of it. She had applied that principle to supply accounts and kitchen inventories and evidence of fraud and the testimony of 6 frightened ranchers in a room. It would be a particular kind of cowardice to stop applying it now. "When I sat down by that water trough," she said, "I had decided something. I had decided that what I said out loud was the truth, that I was a woman people did not choose, that I had accepted that." She held his gaze. "I had accepted it the way you accept a fact of geography. This is the mountain. I cannot move it. I will build my life around it." "And now," he said. "Now I think I may have been wrong about the mountain," she said. Something moved in his face. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter and more lasting than either of those. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, and she looked down at his hand on hers, and did not move away, and the kitchen held them both in the particular grace of a moment that has been arrived at honestly. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because the ranch needs a cook, because I want you here, for as long as you're willing." "Silas," she said, "ask me a clearer question than that." He looked at her. The almost smile arrived, and this time it completed itself fully, and it changed his face in a way she had not yet seen and found she wanted to see again. "Abigail Carter," he said, "will you marry me?" She breathed in. She thought about 11 doors. She thought about $40 and a recipe chest and a water trough in the summer heat of a town that hadn't wanted her. She thought about the lamp burning low in a small room, while she found the truth in a column of figures about the look on Walt's face when he tasted real food for the first time in months, about Caldwell picking up the pen without a speech, about a woman named Agnes Ferris, who had lived 31 years on land that was gone now, about all the things that could have been otherwise if one person with 19 years of careful knowledge had not happened to be sitting in the right place at the right moment. She thought about what she had said to the sky and the dust and the indifferent mountains, and about how wrong she had been, not because the world had changed, but because she had not yet found the one corner of it where someone was going to look at her correctly. "Yes," she said. The territorial investigation opened in September and ran through the fall. Dr. Marsh's feed analysis was entered into the formal record and withstood every challenge Harlan's legal representative raised against it. The supply overcharge documentation organized across 4 years of comparative records by a woman with 19 years of experience and the professional habit of keeping everything proved precise enough that the County Trade Committee's auditor later described it as the most thorough private financial analysis he had encountered in 12 years of regulatory work. Victor Harlan's civil operations were suspended pending the investigation. The Meridian Land Associates registration, once traced and made public, ended his ability to manage the situation through reputation and rumor, because the facts of what he had done were considerably more damaging than any story he could construct about the woman who had exposed it. The Morrison brothers recovered their land through a territorial order, requiring Meridian to divest its fraudulently acquired properties at assessed value. Tom and Agnes Ferris came home to Ferris Creek in October. Agnes cried on the step of their house for 10 minutes, and Tom stood beside her with his hat in his hand, and everyone who heard about it understood something important about what had been at stake. Red Canyon Ranch's cattle gained weight through the fall on clean feed purchased from a new supplier out of Casper. The irrigation channel that had been poorly maintained through the drought years was rebuilt by November, and Silas did the work himself alongside his crew, which was the kind of man he was. The ranch's accounts managed with the precision of someone who had been doing this for 19 years and was now doing it with full access to the complete operation, moved from survival to stability to something that looked by the following spring like genuine prosperity. Abigail and Silas married in October in a ceremony at the Dry Creek Church attended by every ranching family in the valley and presided over by a minister who knew better than to make the service longer than the occasion required. She wore a dress the color of autumn grass that she had made herself, and she carried no flowers because flowers were impractical, and she was not a woman who chose things for their appearance. Hector cried, which surprised everyone, including Hector. Walt made a speech that was short and sincere and therefore better than most wedding speeches anyone in that room had heard. Mrs. Alderman, who had been one of the first to repeat Harlan's version of Abigail to the valley, came to the reception and stood in front of her for a long moment and said, "I misjudged you. I want to say that to your face." Abigail looked at her and said, "Thank you for saying it." No more than that, because more than that wasn't necessary. There were moments in the months that followed when Abigail would be working at the kitchen table accounts, or correspondence, or the increasingly complex logistics of a ranch that was expanding rather than contracting. And Silas would come in and set a cup of coffee beside her without interrupting her, the way he had done from the second morning, and she would look at his hand on the cup and then at his face and feel the particular quality of being known that she had spent 41 years believing was not available to her. She had been wrong, not about the world. The world was exactly as difficult as she had understood it to be, exactly as quick to judge and as slow to correct its judgments, exactly as inclined to decide what a woman was worth before she had finished speaking. All of that was true and remained true, and she had no illusions about it. But she had been wrong about the mountain. The woman who had once sat in the dust of Dry Creek and whispered her deepest truth to no one had not been unloved because she was unlovable. She had been unseen for 41 years, in 11 towns, through 19 years of excellent work done quietly and well. And then, on one ordinary burning summer afternoon, someone had stood behind her at the right moment and heard the thing she said, and had looked at her the way she had never been looked at and had not looked away. She had built something real from that single moment, not because it was enough by itself, but because she had brought to it everything she had ever learned, and every year she had ever worked, and every door that had ever closed, before she finished speaking, and all of it together, had become something neither of them could have made alone. That was not rescue. That was not luck. That was two people finding each other at the precise moment when what each of them was became what the other one needed, and choosing with full knowledge of what that meant to stay. She set down her pencil. She picked up her coffee cup. Outside the window, the ranch was alive in the late afternoon light, and Silas was at the fence talking to Hector, and the cattle were moving across the near pasture, with the unhurried weight of animals that are well and fed and safe. Abigail Carter. Abigail Reed looked at all of it and understood with the same precise certainty she brought to figures and facts and the honest accounting of difficult truths that she had not been wrong to hope. She had simply been waiting without knowing it for someone to finally look correctly. And he had.